Okay, happy holidays and good evening, everybody. This is our first Wednesday. I'm Peter Kariva. Whoops, I'm supposed to do this to the AV staff. I'm Peter Kariva, the CEO and President of the Aquarium. And first I want to acknowledge our sponsors, which the Marriott and the Olson Family and Foundation and Rivers and Mountain Conservancy, which helped us with our watershed classroom. So it's a very appropriate talk. And the talk tonight is on water. I think everybody in California knows it's a big deal. You probably all know the supposed quote by Mark Twain about whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting. He actually never said that as far as we know. There's no evidence he ever said it, but it's a nice quote. But tonight's speaker is Ashley Boren. She's the CEO of Sustainable Conservation. And a confession, I serve on their board, so I'm not going to really introduce her much, except she's a CEO that really knows her subject. And just is sort of a leader in conservation in California. Unlike the quote about water is for fighting, sustainable conservation is about uniting and finding solutions to resource problems where there are fights about them, frankly, and we try to find, and Ashley and sustainable conservation does a better job than almost anybody I know at trying to resolve these. Ashley, thanks a lot. And afterwards, there'll be questions. She'll field questions, and then there's a discussion and free cocktails and all that, and I'll give you some instructions afterwards.
Great.
Nice to see you.
So thanks, Peter, for that introduction and for having me, and thanks everyone for coming tonight. I'm looking forward to talking with you this evening about California's increasingly volatile weather and the mega-droughts and the mega-floods we're experiencing, and how we can innovate how we manage water to better prepare for the future. So I thought I'd first tell you a little bit about myself. I think the thing you need to know is I really love California, and I'm proud to be a Californian. I feel super fortunate to have been raised here and to live here. I grew up here in Los Angeles, and my family spent a lot of time backpacking in the Sierra, exploring the desert, playing at the beach, and it really gave me a real love for nature. So I went to college and studied biology, and after college I worked for the Nature Conservancy for 4 years in Costa Rica, helping Costa Rica expand its national park system, and then in Ecuador, helping that country and the Charles Darwin Research Station manage the Galapagos Islands. Loved all of that, but got very kind of concerned and interested about how business could work more sustainably and be better stewards of resources, since they are limited. And I went and got an MBA, and then I decided I better try that out and work for a business. So I worked for Smith & Hawken, a garden supply company. And working for Smith & Hawken and the Nature Conservancy really prepared me for this role as CEO of Sustainable Conservation, because I'm able to combine my love for nature and natural systems with an aptitude for business and running organizations and a real drive to solve problems. So a little bit about Sustainable Conservation. We're a nonprofit organization that brings Californians together to solve some of California's toughest environmental challenges. And for 30 years, we've engineered common sense solutions for managing California's land, air, and water. And we believe in what's sometimes called the radical middle. We really focus on solutions that make environmental and economic sense, and we work very hard to take into account the perspectives and needs of all the stakeholders involved. So farmers, government, communities, scientists, city residents, conservationists, and most importantly, the people and wildlife of California. And our approach is to try to tackle the right part of a problem where we think we can add value and where we can really have a significant impact. And we, as Peter said, we build partnerships by finding common ground, and everything we do is very much based on science. So before I get into my talk, I want to share a short video that was produced by the Public Policy Institute of California. They're one of Sustainable Conservation's valued partners. They're a nonprofit research organization that provides data-driven, nonpartisan analyses of water, and they recently put together this video that I think does a really good job of summarizing our current situation.
Hillary, as you know, slamming Southern California over the weekend, the first tropical storm to hit the area in more than 80 years.
State's latest snow survey confirms a blockbuster year for snow in the Sierra.
If you live in California, these seemingly contradictory headlines have been a familiar sight. But what exactly is going on? California has always had a variable climate. In fact, when it comes to precipitation, California has the most variable climate in the entire US. However, climate change is making these flips from drought to deluge more intense. Dry periods are hotter and drier, and wet periods often dump more rain in a shorter period of time. So what does this mean for California? Our water supply system was designed for mid-20th century conditions, when temperatures were lower and precipitation, snowpack, and runoff more reliable. Over the last 2 decades, warming, an increasingly thirsty atmosphere, and losses in snowpack are stressing the system like never before. Increasingly severe droughts are not the only problem facing the state. During drought, it's easy to forget that California also experiences wet years and occasionally very large damaging floods. In fact, 1 in 5 Californians live in areas at risk of flooding. Climate projections show a steady increase in the intensity of atmospheric rivers, or flood-generating storms, in the coming years. While this is great for water supply, it increases the risk of severe, life-threatening floods. These changes are posing widespread challenges for our businesses, communities, and ecosystems, and often hit low-income communities the hardest. Managing for drought and flood simultaneously has to become part of California's DNA. This will involve significant investment in our flood control systems and putting as much water in the ground as we can during rainy periods. This past wet season alone, we recharged enough groundwater to supply 11 million homes for a year. This is a good start, but much more is needed. Innovation in managing floods and water storage together will be key to adapting to our increasingly volatile climate.
So I think that video does a really excellent job of describing what we're facing and what we need to prepare for. So I'm going to get this back up. Yeah. So our weather is indeed getting more volatile. So the blue bars in this graph show the annual precipitation in California from 1896 through 2016. And the dotted line close to the middle shows the average. And as you can see, there really is no average precipitation in California, or average year of it. Our weather has always been volatile, but what you see is an increase in volatility with bigger wet years and drier dry years. And experts say this trend will continue and intensify. And in fact, if we extended this graph to 2023, you'd have 3 years of extreme drought, 2020 through 2022, and then an incredible year of precipitation that we had this year in 2023. So what I thought I would do today is first provide a California Water 101 of sorts to get everyone on the same page about where California's water comes from, where does it go, and who gets it along the way. And then I'll talk about some of the innovation that's happening to adapt our water management to climate change, how we fared in this past year, and some lessons learned from that. So most of California water comes in the form of rain and melting snowpack, and the film referred to atmospheric rivers. So what do we mean by that? It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a narrow jets of air that carry huge amounts of water vapor from the tropics. And NASA estimates that each of these rivers carries a water load equivalent to 25 Mississippi rivers. With climate change, these airborne rivers will strike more frequently and more intensely from now on. But even with all the rain we got this past year, we are not out of trouble when it comes to drought. Our changing climate means that we will have more severe and frequent weather extremes, so the cycles of heavy rainfall in the form of these atmospheric rivers will be followed by inevitable drought. So thankfully, we have developed ways to store some of the rain. That's important in order to avoid wasting rainwater. Rainwater in California is often runoff water. It's as if you made a habit of scraping your dinner leftovers into the compost or the disposal instead of putting your pasta or minestrone in a container for lunch the next day. Most of our water rushes down concrete streets, canals, paved over riverbanks, and it's gone, literally down the drain. The Los Angeles Times reported that 80% of Southern California's rainfall runs off and is wasted. That's 80%. Put another way, the amount of runoff from just one big storm in Los Angeles could supply the city's whole population for an entire year. So we obviously have to fix this, and in fact, Los Angeles several years ago passed a proposition to help the county capture stormwater runoff so it can be used. So I'm going to share some other proven approaches with you on how we can do this in other parts of the state as well. So the rainwater that doesn't flow in our rivers out to sea gets stored, either in surface reservoirs or in the snowpack of the Sierra Nevada, which is California's largest reservoir, providing about 1/3 of the state's water. California also gets water from the Colorado River, and that's a major source here in Southern California for cities and for farms. So to summarize, snowpack and the Colorado rain, snowpack, and the Colorado River are California's key sources of surface water. We also have tremendous reserves of groundwater, and I know these terms can be a little confusing, so I'm going to explain the difference. Surface water, see if I get this right. Surface water is found in lakes, rivers, streams, and snowpack, while groundwater is found in the spaces under the earth in geologic formations of soil, sand, and rocks called aquifers. So as the name suggests, surface water is above ground and groundwater is below ground. Think of groundwater as our savings account for the years when it doesn't rain as much. We draw it down for drinking and agriculture and manufacturing, and like any savings account, we have to replenish it. And here too, California has struggled. It wasn't until 2014 that California passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, making it the last Western state to regulate the use of groundwater. This was California's first major law in a century, and it was passed during a major drought when we finally mustered the political will to take action. Regulating groundwater is the stuff of water wars, so it's not hard to understand that politicians want to stay clear. And by the way, the blue on the map of California represents all the state's groundwater basins, which combined have at least three times the storage capacity of all our above ground reservoirs in total. So imagine hundreds of soda straws, maybe thousands, nobody really knows, sucking on the same aquifer. Many of you have heard about people's wells running dry and not having any water coming out from their taps. We're also seeing the damage of drawing too much water out of aquifers when we see cracked roads and bridges and other structures like this aqueduct, which is cracked due to the land sinking. But we can't point to the single straw causing the problem. So everyone leaves their straw right where it is, unless of course they stick it in a little bit deeper to get away from the other straws. Now this is all going to change as the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act goes into effect between now and 2040. But it will take decades to repair the damage and recharge the aquifers. If you imagine an aquifer as a sponge, recharging is the process of adding water to that dried out sponge and making it moist again. So the challenge is to redirect some of the surface water back into the aquifers. So storage and recharge are two essential elements of improving California's water health. So now let's go back to who gets what. If you watch the classic movie Chinatown, I don't have to tell you that who gets water and what cost has long been the subject of contention in California, and for that matter, the entire American West. And it gets tougher when you consider that California has grown a lot since the water wars of the 1930s. It's now home to 40 million people, about 1 of every 8 US residents. California is the 5th largest economy. It's also the country's largest agricultural state. California supplies 2/3 of the country's fruits and nuts, 1/3 of its vegetables, and 20% of its dairy products. So no wonder USA Today has called California the nation's salad bowl. Although the majority of Californians live in urban areas, they use only 20% of its developed water. And when I say developed, I mean the water that is stored and managed for various human uses. The number one use of California's water is, of course, agriculture, and that's the source of many controversies and misunderstandings. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google how much water does it take to grow an almond. During our 2013 to 2015 drought, tension between urban users versus farmers was focused on a tiny but mighty almond. And Mother Jones magazine even ran a cover image of an almond with Dracula fans, and I am not making this up. On the flip side, California's farmers have a lot to say about how our water has been managed, and in their opinion, badly mismanaged. If you've driven on I-5 in the Central Valley, you've seen billboards. Many farmers think that California doesn't understand or appreciate the people who provide their food and who have made this the most productive agricultural region in the world. There are huge gaps of knowledge and a lot of confusion and misinformation about just who in California is a water waster. It seems that whenever we are in these drought these days, there are articles and websites shaming the rich and famous of California by name and number of gallons used for their lavish lawns, golf courses, swimming pools, and front yard fountains. And I live in San Francisco, and some of my favorite Giants baseball players have been taken to task for wasting water. It gets a lot more extreme when you add farmers into the mix, and depending on how you measure it, agriculture uses about 4 times the amount of developed water in California each year as do people in cities and suburbs. But here's the big point. It takes water to grow food, and food is made up mostly of water. As one of only 5 Mediterranean climates in the world, California is able to produce abundant amounts of healthy, nutritious, dense crops. This is something to be celebrated, not to feel guilty about. We are very fortunate to be able to have such fresh and nutritious produce locally, especially for food lovers like myself, and we are fortunate to be able to export our bounty to the rest of the world. So now I've covered where water comes from, how it gets stored, where it gets wasted, and who uses it. The next big challenge I will talk about is how to move it. Rain in California typically falls more heavily in the northern part of the state, and it's redirected for use in the population centers in the Bay Area and Southern California and in the huge agricultural region of the San Joaquin Valley. The story of water in California is a story of transporting it from where it falls and gets stored to where people and farms need it. California's plumbing systems are a complex network of reservoirs, canals, rivers, and groundwater storage sites linking water supplies to major water demand centers. Water stored during wet, winter, and spring months is then available for use during dry summers and our increasingly frequent droughts. So now I'm going to give you a very simplified schematic of the major parts of California's plumbing system, in part to illustrate how interconnected our state is by water. This is the Sacramento River. That's the principal river in Northern California and California's largest river. Coming in from the right is the San Joaquin River, which starts high in the Sierra Nevada and runs about 366 miles through the Delta and into San Francisco Bay. The Los Angeles Aqueduct carries water from eastern Sierra Nevada to Los Angeles. The construction of this aqueduct marked the first major water delivery project in California, and it's the story that the movie Chinatown was based on, the city purchasing 300,000 acres of land, often secretly, in the Owens Valley in order to gain access to water rights. Now we're trying to restore Mono Lake and correct the air quality law violations caused by the dust that was created as the valley dried up, and re-water portions of the Owens River. So LA has begun to reduce its dependence on this eastern Sierra Nevada water, mostly through water conservation. 2 major federal water projects were built in the 1930s. The first was the completion of Hoover Dam, which created Lake Mead and enabled Colorado River water to be stored and distributed, including to California, through the Colorado Aqueduct. The second was the Central Valley Project, which was created by the federal government to provide irrigation and municipal water from reservoirs in the northern half of the state to the Central Valley. This major project was actually initiated by the state, but because of the Great Depression, the federal government had to end up building it. But thanks to the irrigation made possible by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, the semi-arid San Joaquin Valley was transformed into the world's most productive agricultural region. Another huge transfer began in 1960 with the State Water Project under the management of our State Department of Water Resources. And this was the brainchild of Governor Pat Brown and a passion carried on by his son, former Governor Jerry Brown. And this aquatic lifeline brings water from Northern California to Southern California through a series of reservoirs in the Central Valley, and then pumping it over the Tehachapi Mountains in Los Angeles, which is the biggest lift of water in the world. A final element of the system is the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, and the Delta is the terminus of California's largest watershed, the Great Central Valley, and a major water supply hub. The San Francisco Bay and the Delta combined form the largest estuary on the U.S. Pacific coast. So water from the Sacramento and the San Joaquin rivers comes into the Delta and is then exported out to the southern Delta to more than 25 million people and 3 million acres of irrigated farmland in the Bay Area, the San Joaquin Valley, and Southern California. So as you can see, California moves huge quantities of water over vast distances and challenging terrain at enormous costs. And the important point to take away from this map of California's plumbing system is that it's immense, it's expensive, it's outdated, and it's really complex to manage. To add to this, California has over 500 independent water agencies managing this water, so that often makes it very difficult to coordinate the competing priorities across different jurisdictions. And those priorities include flood protection, water supply, reducing the environmental harm from dams, addressing long-term excess pumping and pollution of groundwater, maintaining and updating infrastructure, and adapting to a smaller snowpack and more intense storms as the climate warms. So as the film said, climate change is already affecting California's water and making our challenges even greater in managing it. Our water system was designed for the hydrology and weather patterns of the 20th century, and it's quite inadequate for the realities of a changing climate. This is a picture from a satellite of the Sierra Nevada in February 2019 when we had a snowpack 150% of average. By the end of this century, some models show the Sierra snowpack shrinking by 80%, which will look more like what our snowpack looked like in 2015 at the height of a recent severe drought. So let that sink in. 80% reduction of snowpack in the Sierra Nevada. And the Sierra Nevada is our biggest reservoir. That means that California's water in the future is going to come more in the form of rain and less as snow. And if we don't figure out how to capture it, it will go out to sea. So I know this all sounds troubling, and it is. But fortunately, there's a lot of very good work going on by our State Department of Water Resources, groups like Sustainable Conservation, water agencies, and farmers to adapt our 20th century water management to our 21st century changing climate conditions. And this past year of extraordinary precipitation in California, we got to see some promising results, albeit amongst some catastrophic flooding. So what happened this past year? 31 atmospheric rivers hit California between December and the end of March. While that extraordinary precipitation was unexpected by our weather forecasters, in fact, everyone thought we were, in early December, everyone thought we were headed into a fourth year of severe drought, which was going to be very challenging. But we really shouldn't have been surprised because climate experts have been predicting with climate change that these airborne rivers will strike more frequently and more intensely from now on. And because of how much water arrived in such a short time, we were actually very fortunate that we were coming out of a drought because our reservoirs were empty. And so there was time for those to fill up and collect water. But not everyone was protected by the reservoirs. We have many undammed creeks, and those overflowed quickly. This is a picture of the town of La Planada in Merced County, which suffered very serious damage from flooding, as did numerous other towns and people. As the year went on and the reservoirs filled, more water needed to be released from them, and that caused flooding, as you can see here, and much of that going out to sea. Fortunately, much of the precipitation came as snow this past year. The blue line in these graphs show the historic year of snowpack that we had in the northern, central, and southern Sierra through April 23rd of this past year. The northern Sierra got a lot of snow, but not as much as in the 82-83 year. The central Sierra hit a record, and the southern Sierra was 283% of average. Here's an aerial photo of the snowpack this past year on the right compared to the 3 prior years. Not only were we lucky that much of the precipitation arrived as snow, we were also fortunate that we had no extended warm spells, so the snow was able to melt slowly. If the temperatures had been warmer, or if we had had more hot spells, the snow could have melted quickly, and that would have made the flooding even more catastrophic. And as it was, Tulare Lake reemerged after decades. This image is an artist's rendering of what our great Central Valley looked like before the Europeans arrived and before we had developed cities and agriculture. And you can see in the artist's rendering that Tulare Lake there at the bottom of the valley, it was bigger in area than Lake Tahoe, although much shallower. And agriculture changed that by diverting the water through canals for farms, but this year those canals were overwhelmed by the floodwaters and Tulare Lake came back. And it's estimated it may take up to 2 years before it fully evaporates. Tulare Lake has a clay bottom, so that's not an area where recharge is possible. So California has always experienced droughts and floods, but they will become more frequent and intense in the future, and in wet years with more of the precipitation coming as rain and less as snow. So to adapt to this changing climate, it's critical that we change how we've been managing water and do a much better job of integrating the management of surface and groundwater. California has always done some recharge. Historically, in above average precipitation years, when there was excess water, that water was diverted to recharge basins like this one. And then in dry years, those basins would just sit dry. But you could never build enough of these recharge basins to capture all of the water that you would have wanted to in a year like we just experienced. So Sustainable Conservation and others are advocating that we mimic what nature used to do and spread that water out, slow it down, and let it sink into the groundwater aquifers below. Before we had cities and agriculture in the Central Valley, all that water used to come down out of the Sierra Nevada and spread out across the valley. It was basically like one giant wetland. California has taken some steps. This is a picture of the Yolo bypass, an area which is a flood bypass, an area of fields that where water can be diverted when the Sacramento River is threatening to overtop its banks and flood the city of Sacramento. Groups like River Partners are also restoring floodplains like this one in the picture, which is at the confluence of the Tuolumne and San Joaquin rivers. And it used to be farmland, and it flooded fairly regularly, so River Partners purchased it, restored the floodplain, and now it's California's most recent state park. And it provides flood protection to downstream communities, and it also provides fantastic habitat for wildlife. We can also direct those high water flows to farmland with good sandy soils that percolate water quickly through the surface and into the aquifers. And sustainable conservation was introduced to this concept by a farmer named Don Cameron, who you see here in this picture. Don farms at the end of the Kings River in Fresno County, which is in the San Joaquin Valley, and he's entirely dependent on groundwater to irrigate his 6,000 acres of crops. The Kings River regularly floods, so he got the idea to let it flood onto his land with the purpose of recharging the groundwater aquifer below him. His neighbors thought he was crazy. They thought he would kill his crops. This is not something that's done in the valley. But in 2011, 2017, 2019, all wet years, and again this past year, he's recharging significant amounts of water with no impact on the health or the yields of his crops. There's really great potential for this low-cost method of groundwater recharge across the San Joaquin Valley, and Sustainable Conservation's been actively promoting it, conducting research, and developing the tools and policy to make this standard practice. Many of these approaches, flood bypasses, floodplains, and recharge on farms, have come together under a concept called FloodMAR, Flood Managed Aquifer Recharge, that Sustainable Conservation, the Department of Water Resources, and others are promoting. So starting at the top of the watershed in this schematic, the idea here is that we can operate our reservoirs not only to supply drinking water and irrigation water and for flood control, but also to optimize groundwater recharge. That water can then be spread out on many types of landscapes: flood bypasses, floodplains, orchards, active farmland, fallow farmland, and recharge basins. There are many parts of the state that have sandy soils that enable water to percolate down into the aquifer very quickly. And the map on the left is a soil suitability index that a scientist at UC Davis produced. Everything that is green to yellow has good soils in the top 6 inches for recharge. And then that map on the right, or just the Central Valley, combines the soil suitability index with information on the underlying geology below that 6 inches to identify the best places to recharge. And as you can see, there's a lot of green in the southern part of the Central Valley, particularly on the eastern side. Sustainable Conservation has been helping establish pilot sites in areas good for recharge and then getting the word out through grower workshops where growers talk to growers. And the number of farmers participating is increasing. This is one of our demo sites that was ready to go in January when it started to flood. So in 2011, we started with 1 farmer. In 2017, the next water year, we had more farmers participating and were able to recharge more groundwater, and again, more in 2019. And I really cannot wait to see the numbers for 2023, the final numbers. This graph only tracks the numbers through the end of March. And as you can see, we were able to recharge significantly more in 2019, and that number is going to be much higher when we have the numbers for the full year. And this is just the ones we were tracking closely. One of our longtime partners, the Tulare Irrigation District, had an incredibly successful year, unlike their neighbors in the greater Tulare Basin. There, they and their farmers recharged around 100,000 acre-feet just themselves by the end of the season, and they were successful because they were prepared. The farmers were educated, they were open to accepting floodwater on their fields for recharge. The district provided a very powerful incentive of giving farmers pumping credit for the water they recharged. And remember that these farmers now have pumping limits due to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And they also built a pond specifically to recharge the low-income communities' drinking water supply. And they reduced downstream flood risk. None of their canals overtopped. And as a result, their groundwater levels rose 30 feet in 1 year. And so for context, their neighbors in the greater Tulare Basin, they did not see their ground levels rise at all, despite the torrential amounts of rain we had last year. So the question is, can more of this kind of uncontrolled flooding be avoided, and can we simultaneously prepare ourselves for droughts, which we know are coming? Sustainable Conservation has partnered with the Department of Resources and others to model by watershed climate change scenarios for snowpack and runoff, and we've looked at reoperating reservoir releases to optimize groundwater recharge. With a groundwater recharge assessment tool that we've developed with our partner Earth Genome, we then look at where that water coming from the reservoirs and the undammed streams can be directed to spread out, slow down, and sink into the groundwater aquifers. And then the Department of Water Resources has models that can predict where that water that is recharged will move underground. Our groundwater recharge assessment tool is a spatial and temporal software tool that compiles all the information about soil type, underlying geology, crop type, so we know what crops can handle a lot of water at what times of year, conveyance, so where the rivers and canals carry that water, and then it ranks fields that will be the most effective for recharge by field. Let's see. In the case of the modeling studies we're doing with the Department of Water Resources, it assesses how much of the climate scenarios for runoff can be diverted spread out and slowed down to sink into the ground, and then how much is left over and still presents a flood risk. Here's a screenshot of what the tool can produce, which is a map of the specific locations where recharge will be most effective, represented by the dark green. So we completed this one of these flood modeling studies for the Merced River watershed, and what we found is that just by using existing canal conveyance and available farmland, it was possible for them to recharge enough to address 31% of their groundwater overdraft in that basin. This is a very natural solution. It costs relatively little, and it's very low-hanging fruit that can be acted on now. If we operate reservoirs differently, so let water out more slowly with the intent of actually recharging groundwater, we could offset the overdraft by 46%. And then if we expand conveyance with new canals and also developing more floodplains, we could address 63% of that overdraft number. And then very importantly, that would reduce the flood risk by 65%. And that's critical because in this watershed, there is a six-fold, they predict that there will be a six-fold increase in the amount of floodwater. So just for numbers, think that there's 8,000 cubic feet coming down that river in an average year. Take that up to 64,000. That's going to cause tremendous damage if we can't figure out how to divert it. So this is critically important for many rural communities that are in the path of those floodwaters. So we're in the process of conducting these studies in 5 additional watersheds and hope to do them for all the watersheds coming out of the Sierra. It's really critical information for water agencies to adapt their water management to climate change. So the answer to whether we can adapt our water systems to climate change is going to depend on, of course, on how much our climate warms and whether we can reduce our emissions quickly enough to avoid the worst. But there is much we can do if we think differently, and importantly, if we work with nature and not against her. So before I wrap up, I thought I would just say, what can we all do? And what can you do? You can continue to get educated about water in California. It is a fascinating and really absolutely critical topic for all Californians to understand. Remember the schematic I shared? We all connected by water. So let's stop blaming. Stop blaming and start rewarding and appreciating everyone who's making progress. Whether it's the city dweller who replaces a lawn, a farmer who takes the risk of recharging the groundwater aquifer, a manufacturer who goes to zero waste water at their facility, or even the kid next door who adopts a storm drain. You can support your fellow Californians, whether it's yourselves here in Southern California, where water use has gotten much more efficient, or farmers who are also gotten more efficient. Let's be different than Washington, D.C., and be one California with one water ecosystem and work together to ensure we can continue to supply California and the nation with healthy and nutritious food. We can supply all Californians with clean drinking water, and that our fish and wildlife thrive. And consider drought-tolerant landscapes for your homes. Half of water use in urban areas goes to landscaping. So reducing our water use outdoors is a huge opportunity to support the rest of the state. So the story of water in California has always been dramatic, a competition for scarce resources, often resulting in open conflict and some good movies. But the story of water in California also shows ingenuity, determination, remarkable engineering achievements, social change on a massive scale, and economic growth. Adapting to the extremes caused by climate change will require an even greater effort, but Californians are up to the challenge, and we always have been. And I've outlined some of the innovative ways California can create a 21st century water system and remain a world leader in economic and environmental terms. And I'd be glad to take any questions.
Shelby, volunteers, handing out.
Thank you for a very informative presentation. I understand the situation with the agricultural areas and how we can recharge perhaps the aquifers there somewhat. But what about the urban areas, such as the cities with the streets and all the runoff which occurs that we are not capturing at all? Is something being done about that?
Yes, I mentioned that, well, I think it was Los Angeles County passed a Proposition O, I believe, several years ago, and that is specifically to capture stormwater runoff. It's more challenging in urban areas when they've all been developed up and paved over. You've got to find areas where you've got, you know, permeable surfaces, but there's a lot more work now, even on new developments, that instead of paving things over, having permeable driveways, for instance, so the water can soak through. And Southern California actually does have quite a bit of recharge basins. There's a lot of spreading basins where we are recharging water outside the city limits where there's more available land. So actually here in Long Beach, I looked it up when I came, 60% of the water in Long Beach comes from groundwater. So it is being recharged. Sometimes it's injected in when there isn't enough space to, you know, let it spread out and slow down. But it's a very, groundwater is such a critical climate adaptation strategy. We just have to have it, you know, for drought. So but there is active recharge that happen in a lot of the state, including here. Yeah.
Regarding water usage in the state, what percentage does agriculture use and what percentage is urban usage?
So agriculture uses 80% of developed water, and urban uses 20%. And I want to really stress developed water. There's a lot of water that's also supporting, you know, scenic rivers and other things. We're not counting that. We're only counting the water that we take for some kind of human use when we say developed water. So of that developed water, 80% does go to agriculture and 20% to urban areas. And I will say that is pretty common. Anywhere that has a agriculture producing region, it uses most of the water because it just takes water to grow food. So it's not unusual.
Okay. I have a question about the farming and letting the water spread out. So levees are used to control flooding.
Yeah.
What is the actual tactical way that you manage flooding, you know, in a controlled way?
Yeah. So one of those pictures I showed of the pilot site that was ready to go in January, some folks are, you know, right near the canal. So that woman, Christine Gemperle, she's an organic almond orchard, and she's right next to a canal, and there's a turnout from the canal to her field, which she has kind of a ditch canal around it, and she just lifts the gate. It's that easy. Not everybody is in that position, so that's some of the additional conveyance that may be needed, but there are a number of folks that can do it. The other thing that happened this year is a number of folks pumped water out of bypasses and over those levees into their fields, was another way that it happened.
Hi, over here.
Yeah.
Right. How's water allocated now in California? Is on price, geography, purpose, and who makes those decisions?
So water is allocated based on water rights. So, and California has a complex system of water rights. We could have a whole long session on that. I'm not an expert, but I know the basics. We have what's called senior water rights. So people who were here before 1914, they're called pre-1914 rights. They're senior, they're pretty darn secure. They get their water first. And then junior rights holders come after that time, and 2014, I mentioned right that 2014 was the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. The law that was passed 100 years earlier was a new water right law and system. That's what happened 100 years earlier. That is all more closely tracked and registered with our State Water Quality Control Board. There are also what's called riparian rights. So if you live along a river or stream, you have access to some of that river water. Groundwater, there was no water rights to it. Supposedly you could only take out a correlative amount. You couldn't cause harm, but as I showed or tried to illustrate with those straws, nobody was tracking. You know, it was a classic tragedy of the commons where, you know, everybody was taking it. And that's why the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was such a critical piece of legislation for California. who referees, was asked who referees the allocation of water. It's our state water quality control board. They are responsible for managing this, and it's not an easy process. It's, we're California, we're very modern, we got a great tech industry. This year they've decided to allocate money to digitize water rights, the records, because they are in a basement of the state water board. I mean, somebody described it to me. I mean, really, paper records, in pre-1914, there's stories that people would, paste a notice to a tree and claim the water right. They're working through all of that to get it digitized, because without it that way, it's hard to manage. But they are responsible.
Hi, thank you very much. Great presentation. I have to say, go Dodgers. I know, and I had to say it.
I bet some of them wasted water too.
Yeah, you're right. So question with the replenishing of the groundwater, is there any correlation between the San Andreas Fault and liquefaction and having any unstable conditions as we get into this preparedness for the big one that's coming? Is there anything that...
That is such a good question, and I do not know the answer to that, but you've definitely piqued my curiosity, so I'm going to go ask some of my hydrogeologist friends and find out. Yeah, I don't know.
How many farmers or how much farmland is participating in the pilot program, and how many could potentially participate?
That's a good question. I think we probably have, there's probably between 300 and 500 farmers who participated this year. That's a rough guess. And we're going to need thousands, like, to really scale this approach for the amount of water, we're talking about. We'll have to scale it bigger. So, but it's possible, and it is catching on. I'll tell a story. So that Don Cameron, when everybody thought he was crazy. And actually people, they didn't trust him. And we would do these grower workshops, and he would be our spokesperson. And as it started to expand, we'd get another grower and we'd say, could you please, speak at this workshop and talk to other growers about your experience. It was really hard because they were worried they were going to be kind of mocked, and looked at strangely because they were doing something that was just so out of the norm. This year, at our grower workshop, we had growers lined up to take the microphone to talk about how great a solution this was and how they could be part of the solution to more groundwater sustainability. So the attitude is it's catching on, it's changing, and again, it's kind of growers looking over the border at other growers and seeing what they're doing and being successful. I think it will really help. And incentives are super important because it is a risk. Well, I want it to be fast. This year was really a great, I was talking about the difference between Tulare Irrigation District and next door. Those people in the next door area, they really, having a crisis like this definitely makes you able to take kind of a leap. I feel like change is often incremental, and then we have a year like this and you get a big leap. So it's hard to predict, but the Groundwater Management Act is another big incentive, so I'm hopeful in the next 10 to 20 years we could scale it. Yeah.
Hi, so since a lot of the change comes from political acts, are there any bills or anything on the horizon that we as voters should look out for, or things that we should try to push, or anything that with our vote we can make a difference?
Let's see, I'm not sure the legislature starts up again in January. And so when we find out about bills is in January. The only one I know of is a little bit nuanced. One of the good things that happened this year was, and partly Sustainable Conservation advocated for this, there was a lot, because of water rights, who was asking about that. It's a very confusing system. And so people were really confused about whether they could actually take that flood water. Could they divert it onto their field or pump it out? And so the governor issued a very important executive order in March that said, if your local county or your flood agency says we're at flood stage, you can take the water. Just you need to tell us where you're taking it, how much you end up taking and recharge. You got to monitor it and report. That was huge. Just that act enabled 400,000 acre feet of water to be recharged. So they then codified that in legislation, SB 122. That needs a little bit of refining to make it super clear. So that will probably be a bill that's going through. But that's the only one I know about right now.
Time for one more question? I see two. We've got two more questions.
Could you talk a little bit more about the injection process? How much is that adding to our groundwater?
I'm probably not the best person to answer that, but I do know, I'm pretty sure the central water basin here in Southern California, that is the primary method. I don't know how large that basin is, but it's significant. It's significant, yeah.
Hey, I just wanted to follow up.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I took
No,
the
you
last
get
one,
to go
guys.
before Peter.
So I just wanted to follow up on, you said that you needed incentives for farmers and the
Yes.
best way to get people on board is farmers talking to farmers, right? But are all crops suitable for that process? Because you mentioned
That's
that
a great
it was
question.
only some specific ones.
Yeah.
And are there any incentives for farmers to switch to crops that would be suitable for that kind of flooding process?
It's a great question. Yes, there are some crops that are way more suitable for this. Grapes are great. Vineyards are really good for handling large volumes of water. So's alfalfa. Almonds are good if you do it during their dormant season, so kind of January, February before they go to bloom. Same with walnuts, pistachios. Citrus is not good. It doesn't like it. So that's not a good type of crop. Your question about I think there is kind of an incentive. If you're an area that's really groundwater overdrafted and you know that, particularly if an irrigation district is going to incentivize you, there probably is an incentive to switch to crops that are more. But they then have to take that into account with market conditions now. Like right now, we probably have more almonds than the market can handle, so we're going to see less almonds. So they're not going to plant almonds because the market's not good. But maybe they'll do pistachios. It's a good point.
Okay, the one last question is, you've talked about too much and too little water. How about too dirty water?
Yeah. So too dirty water, there's lots of different kinds of dirty water. When you get runoff from farm fields or from our streets, into waterways, you get pollution going into rivers and streams and into our coastal waters. That is definitely not healthy for fish and wildlife. And so there's lots of efforts to try to reduce that, both at the source, but also through other methods. And then groundwater has had a lot of pollution over the years because we have had such a large agricultural farming operations in the Central Valley, on the Central Coast, in Ventura, and farmers have become more efficient with their fertilizer use over the decades, but there's a lot of legacy nitrogen from fertilizer use and also pesticides that's in that soil. So a lot of groundwater has been contaminated by nitrates, and in fact, there's 1 million Californians that do not have reliable access to clean drinking water. And it's for two reasons. Sometimes it's because water was pumped out so much by farming that the well levels dropped and they could not afford to dig their well deeper. But in other cases, that it may be that they can reach it, but it's polluted with nitrates. So one of the things we're working on is if you're bringing in a lot of clean Sierra water and you recharge, you're going to flush some of those nitrates and things down. But if you keep putting water on, over time you're going to dilute it and you're going to improve that water quality, assuming that farmers are using very good agronomic practices. So it's an area that there is some science on. We need more science, and it's an area we're actively working on to make sure recharge doesn't worsen conditions, and ideally we improve conditions over time.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Okay, I think you can all see that Ashley is a very understated expert that really is one of California's leaders in water. I just want to say that thank you for this year of First Wednesdays. We'll start the next year in January. And the first one in January is going to be National Parks Adventure. It'll be a film and then a discussion of your experience in nature and how it affects your mental health, your blood pressure, your cortisol, your stress. It's one of my areas of research. So it's get out in nature is one of the messages. But it'll be a beautiful film on this screen, and then we'll go back to more of the presentations. And afterwards, please exit down in the front. Go out that way, and Ashley will be available for deeper conversations. You should have gotten a card when you came in. You can go claim it for a free cocktail. Lots of activities for a conversation. And just thank everybody, not just Ashley, but thank you for being part of First Wednesdays. So give yourself a applause. So come on down.